There we go.
I forgot about that.
That's okay.
Well, and last time it said full, so I recorded to my computer and then I forgot to send it to her. She
You know,
never.
that is what it is.
Hey, there's one of mine in.
Yay.
I'm amazed. It's not the one I wanted to come though, because all of them need to.
Right.
My unit 4 just killed them. All right. If
You
you're
ready
ready,
to
I'm
start letting kids in?
Yeah.
All right.
good. I'd have been lying when I said white night. Okay. A few of you are still joining audio. As you come in, it should automatically mute you. Okay, if it does not for some reason, go ahead and make sure that you are muted. And let me go into our norms slide. Okay. Your video does not have to be on. If you want to leave it on, that is perfectly fine. Okay, I do want to remind you that this session will be recorded. Okay, so should any problems arise, there will be a recording of it. I don't expect any, but just in case. Go ahead and join the Pear Deck. Okay, the code is on the screen and it's joinpd.com. Okay, and a couple of you are already in. And we'll get started once we have quite a few people in the Pear Deck. All right, guys, if you have any trouble getting in the Pear Deck, please let us know. I know we've had a few little issues here lately with Pear Deck and just a few little glitches. So if you're having trouble, that's fine. Make sure you let us know so that we can make sure you get in and we take care of it. Okay, and also I see at least 1 or 2 teachers. If you don't mind, just send one of us a message and, say, hey, my name is, I'm a teacher at, so that we can get you down for attendance. Okay, and there's another teacher joining. Okay. And give everybody about 30 more seconds to get in the Pear Deck. Guys, as a reminder, if you are not in the Pear Deck, you don't get the takeaways. I know some teachers require them. Like you have to have the takeaway to show them that you were present. I know I require my students to do that whenever I require them to join the study sessions. Okay, so make sure that you join the Pear Deck so you have that proof that you were in today. All right. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started so that we don't run out of time. Pear Deck code will be in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Sorry, guys. And then if Ms. Weller doesn't mind, she can put it in the chat, joinpd.com and the code. That way you have it. All right. So right off the bat, this is the AP Macroeconomic Study session. Okay, so if you're supposed to be in Gov or something else, this is the wrong link. You will need to talk to your teacher to figure out what link you're supposed to be in. Okay. So it looks like everybody has covered monetary policy, so this should just be a review. All right, let's get started. So monetary policy is the policy used by central banks to change the money supply and interest rate. Okay, so contrary to popular belief, the government does not control money. Okay, they cannot just print money whenever they feel like it. So monetary policy is how we affect the money supply, and that is the central bank's job. Okay, so we have a couple of tools of monetary policy, and new this year is what we call the ample reserve system. Okay, but your teacher should have talked about both of these, limited reserves and ample reserves. Okay, so limited reserves, one of the tools is the reserve ratio or requirement. Okay, and we're going to break these down one by one a little bit later. So we're trying to kind of buzz through right now, and I'll define them on the next couple of slides. Okay, the discount rate. Okay, open market operations, and that's buying and selling bonds. We also shorten it to OMO. Okay, and then in ample reserves, we have administered interest rates. All right, so we're going to break those down in just a second, but I did want to remind you, okay, monetary policy is used to affect interest rates, okay, to influence interest rates. And interest rates are your cost of borrowing. Right, so that's going to change your interest sensitive spending. That's going to be capital, homes, cars, credit cards, and that will affect C and I of AD. Okay, so this is how central banks affect the economy as a whole. Okay, and this is one of my favorite cartoons for this. Now, of course, we do not necessarily use limited reserves anymore, but these used to be in our monetary policy toolbox. Okay. All right. So let's talk about limited versus ample. Right away, you can see the graphs are different. Okay. Essentially, limited reserves are just this downward sloping portion of the ample reserves market. Okay. It's kind of like a zoomed in version. All right. So on the left, limited reserves are limited because banks lend most of their excess reserves. So they don't keep anything extra in their vaults. Okay. They're lending it all out. Now, if we change the money supply, it's going to change the nominal interest rate. Okay. So your nominal is, of course, equal to your real plus your expected inflation. Okay. So anytime that shifts, nominal interest rate is going to change. So that's going to change the interest rate on any loan that you take out. All right. On the right, we have ample reserves. Okay. And what that means is reserves are abundant. Required reserve ratio is 0. Okay, so even if you give banks more money, okay, so what? We just have more money. That's great. So changing the money supply doesn't really change the nominal interest rate anymore. Okay, and you can see that if you look, this perfectly vertical line, it doesn't matter which way the supply of reserves moves, the policy rate's going to stay the same. Okay, so one word of caution on this. Okay, if the question states the Federal Reserve, we have to assume ample reserves. So this graph over here on the right. Okay, we no longer use limited reserves in the United States, and the exam does expect you to know that. Okay, so Federal Reserve, ample reserves. Okay, now let's break them down, and we're going to look at limited reserves first. Okay, so limited reserves use those 3 tools that we talked about, the reserve requirement, the discount rate, or open market operations to affect the money supply, to change the money supply. Okay, so if we increase the money supply, we're going to have a rightward shift of the money supply curve, that vertical line. Okay, a decrease is a leftward shift. And I think most of you have probably been in a study session with me by now, and you may have heard this, but my dumb way to remember what way curves shift, and I picked this up from one of the first trainings that I ever went to, he said, tell them Erdl the turtle, and they will never forget it. Like IRDL, increase right, decrease left, and the turtle part's just to make it stick. Okay, it sounds dumb, but it does actually work. So anytime there's an increase, we shift to the right. Anytime there's a decrease, we shift to the left. Okay, so put that in your toolbox if you want to use it. All right, so let's talk more about these tools. The reserve requirement is just a percentage of deposit that banks are required to hold. Okay, so if the reserve requirement's 10% and you deposit $1,000, they have to hold $100 of your deposit. Okay. The discount rate is the rate that banks pay to borrow from the central bank. Okay, and we always like to say that the discount rate is like, you don't want to borrow from the central bank. That's like going to your parents when you're 30 years old saying, hey, I need a loan because I don't have enough money. Okay, we don't really want to borrow from the central bank. And that's what that discount rate goes with. Okay, open market operations, that's just buying and selling of bonds. Okay, and guys, if I go too fast, please tell me to slow down. If you have any questions, unmute, put them in the chat. We're happy to help. Okay, so let's move on to actually shifting the curve. Okay, if we want to increase the money supply, that means we want to push more money into the economy. Okay, and if we're in limited reserves, there are a couple of ways that they can do that. They can buy bonds. So that means that they are giving the banks and or people money. Okay, they are buying bonds from us. And whenever they give us money, we're going to go spend that money, right? Okay, so that's going to close a negative output gap. Okay, they can decrease the reserve ratio, meaning that banks can loan out more money than they could previously. Okay, maybe they drop that reserve ratio to 5% instead of 10%. Okay, and now if we deposit $1,000, they only have to hold $50 of it instead of $100. Okay, that's $50 more that they can lend out. Okay, and decreasing the discount rate. So they're going to make it cheaper to borrow money, cheaper for banks to borrow money. Okay, and a helpful tip on open market operations, I'm sorry, I forgot to say this earlier. Okay, buy equals big. So you buy bonds, you make the money supply bigger. Okay, so buy equals big. All right. So if the central bank takes any of these steps, it is expansionary monetary policy, and that's going to close, hopefully, a negative output gap. Okay, so if we're in a recession, they're going to do one of these three things if it is limited reserves. Okay, and your questions will be very specific. They will say operating in a limited reserve system. Okay, and that should be your key. Hey, I'm using money market, which is what this graph is called over here on the right. Okay. All right, and that's what your curve would look like. Okay, we have IE, and that's going to decrease the interest rate, which will increase interest sensitive spending, which will increase investment and consumption, and shift AD to the right. Okay. All right, now it's your turn. So we're going to assume the economy is currently in a negative output gap and uses limited reserve systems. Okay, in response, the central bank increases the money supply. Draw and label the change. Okay, and I know if you're on a phone, this might be a little bit harder. Just do your best. Okay, and we will try to leave feedback as much as we can. Okay, if you don't get feedback, that's not saying anything about your answer. We just ran out of time. Okay. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and look at an answer. Okay, and I know these are hard to graph, and I am extremely impressed with this response because there's no way my lines would have been this straight. All right, so we have money supply shifting to the right. Okay, that is an increase in money supply. This person very clearly showed the decrease in the interest rate. Okay, so this would have been a shift in show point, okay, that you would have received. All right, and then over here on ADAS, AD is shifting to the right. And we know that is because there was a decrease in there was a decrease in interest rates, which caused an increase in interest sensitive spending. So that would be consumption and or investment. Okay, and that would shift AD to the right. Now, typically they're going to ask you to take that a step further and say, okay, what happens to price level output and or real GDP and or unemployment? Okay, so price level would increase, output would increase, unemployment would fall. Okay, and we can tell all that from these two graphs. Okay, most common mistake I saw on these was, let's see. Yeah, we were trying to shift money demand. Okay, remember the central bank only shifts money supply. They're not going to shift money demand. Okay, so anytime you see central bank and money supply, you should be focused on that vertical line. Okay, and I see a few of you still changing answers, so if you need another couple of seconds, that's okay. I'm extremely impressed with some of these drawings, though. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and whenever you receive these paired decks, you will have correct answers on them if you need them. Okay. All right. Oh, I got ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Okay, so when this happens, what is the result on real output and unemployment? So go ahead and type that answer in. That way it's on your takeaway. Okay, looks like we're still changing a few responses. All right, so we're gonna look at two responses here. Output increases, unemployment decreases. That is perfectly fine. I'm always happy to see like a keep it simple question or answer. Okay, so increase in real output and decrease in unemployment, that would work as well. This is one area where I want to caution you. If it does not say explain, don't explain it. Okay, I know, especially like if you're coming out of APUSH or Gov, you really, really, really want to write a lot. Okay, the great thing about macro is we don't have to do that. If it doesn't say explain, you can explain yourself out of a point. Okay, we have to read the entire response, and if you contradict yourself, we have to take that point away. Okay, and believe me, we don't want to take points away. We want to give points. So if it doesn't say explain, don't explain. You can explain it in your head, but don't write it down on the paper. Okay, and while we're on this slide, I'm going to go ahead and mention one more thing. Okay, don't skip steps. We were practicing explaining in my class today. It's like one misstep, you will lose all the points. Okay, so like this question, you show the money supply shifting to the right. You would have to say there was a decrease in the nominal interest rate. And then you would have to tie that into that interest sensitive spending. Okay. Then you would have to tie it to investment or consumption and then to AD before you could go here. Okay. So it's kind of like you have to close the loop. We can't skip steps and expect to get the credit. That's just how it is on this exam. Okay. So we don't need a ton, but we've got to have every single step. And if it doesn't say explain, don't explain. Okay. All right. Okay. So decreasing the money supply. The central bank basically does all of the opposite stuff. Okay. We sell bonds. And our little dumb way to remember this is sell small. Okay. Sell bonds, small money supply. Okay. And they can also increase the reserve ratio. So maybe they take that reserve ratio from 10 to 20%, meaning that now every bank has to hold 20% of each demand deposit instead of 10%, meaning they can't loan that extra 10% out. Okay. And then we can also increase the discount rate. Okay. Making it more expensive for banks to borrow money to lend to you. Okay, and this is what we call contractionary monetary policy, and it is typically used to correct a positive or inflationary output gap. Okay, so if you want to see what it looks like on the graph, okay, we would show our shift to the left and an increase in the interest rate. Okay, and these are what we call shift and show points. Okay, you shift and then you show what happens. So you can't skip that show part or you'll lose the point. Okay. All right. So let's look at another example question. Okay, suppose the economy is currently in a positive output gap and they have a limited reserve system. In response, the central bank decreases the money supply. Draw and label the change on each graph. Okay, remember, whenever we shift, we have to show. I'll give you a few more seconds to finish up. Y'all don't forget your labels. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of missing labels. Okay, I'm gonna look at two different responses on this one. It looks like most everybody's finishing up. Okay, all right, this first one, I'm really impressed with the lines. Uh, That's not the easiest thing to do on Pear Deck. All right, so we have our money supply shifting to the left. Okay, and we have an increase in the interest rate, and then over here, we have a decrease in aggregate demand, and we're showing our new price level. Okay, so perfect on the shift and the labels. Okay, now this other one I wanted to look at, because it brings up an important point whenever we're graphing. Okay, over here we had the money supply shift correct. The only thing, don't forget those labels. I know on Pear Deck it's not as easy as on paper. Okay, over here, notice that this person shifted AD past long run equilibrium. That's okay. Okay, this would still get the point because the prompt did not specifically say that they achieved long run equilibrium. Okay, as long as that AD shifts to the left, that's all we're looking for this point. Okay, so this would be okay if you had your labels. So don't forget those labels, guys. Okay. All right, so let's look at the correct answers. Okay, and again, these will be on your takeaways, so that way you can go back and look at them if you need to. Okay, so money supply shifted to the left, raising interest rates. And we know that we don't borrow money when interest rates are high. We want to save money when interest rates are high. Okay, so interest sensitive spending is going to decrease, decreasing investment consumption, which decreases AD. Now, let's take that one step further. And I want you to tell me, when money supply shifts to the left, what happens to real output and unemployment? Okay, and remember, it's as simple as reading the graph. All right, so let's look at a few responses so we don't run over. Okay, so real output will decrease while unemployment will increase. Okay, that is perfectly acceptable, short and sweet. All right, so I wanted to look at this for one more second. All right, so we have AD shifting to the left, and Y, our current output is getting closer to zero. Remember, over here where our axis meets, always zero. So if we get closer to zero, that means the output's decreasing. And if output's decreasing, we don't need workers. So unemployment is going to increase at the same time. Okay, so they have an inverse relationship. All right, let's look at a practice multiple choice question. Okay, so the graph to the left shows two aggregate demand curves, 81 and 82, and an aggregate supply curve. The shift in the aggregate demand curve from 81 to 82 could be caused by. Okay, and use your process of elimination on these types of questions. Okay, looks like we've kind of settled and most everybody has responded. I'm gonna show you how I would work on one of these questions. All right, so I know that I'm looking for a decrease in aggregate demand because my aggregate demand is shifting to the left. All right, I'm gonna go through a decrease in taxes. Well, that's gonna give me more money to spend, meaning I'm probably gonna go spend it. Okay, so that would increase consumption and or investment, shifting 80 to the right. So I'm gonna mark A out because that's not gonna be true. Okay, and that should have been a marker, not a highlighter, sorry. All right, a decrease in the money supply. Well, okay, I'm in limited reserves. If the money supply decreases, then interest rates are going to rise. Okay, that means that I'm not buying stuff that I've got to borrow money for. And I'm probably not going to spend much on credit because it's going to be more expensive for me. So that's going to decrease C and or I. So B is actually going to be our correct answer. Okay, so I'm going to put a check mark over B, but we're going to go on ahead and look at the others. Okay, an increase in government spending, that's a direct injection into AD. Okay, and that's going to shift AD to the right. So C would not be correct either. Okay, D is going to be the same as C, that direct injection. So D is not going to be right. All right, and then if we look at E, an increase in the price level, I can show that without shifting a curve because it's over here on my axis. Okay, so E would not be a shift at all, so it can't be correct either. Okay, so your correct answer on this is B as in boy. Okay, so if you want to change your answer, go ahead and do that before I change the slide. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I guess I need to clear my annotations. All right, so another practice multiple choice. And these are the types of questions that you will see to specify limited or ample reserves as well. All right, for a country whose banking system has limited reserves, an open market operation by the country's central bank to reduce the unemployment rate would be 2. Okay, so we're wanting to reduce the unemployment rate. Maybe a few more seconds. We saw a little bit of movement on the answer options. Okay, looks like we've settled. I'm not going to lock responses, so you can roll through it with me. All right, so I want to reduce the unemployment rate. So I'm going to go through and, okay, what type of monetary policy is that going to be? Expansionary or contractionary? Okay, I know if I want to reduce unemployment, that means I need to expand the economy. All right, so I know I've got to have expansionary monetary policy. So I'm going to look through my answer options. Okay, sale bonds, that's going to do the opposite of what I want. Okay, so I can mark out A, B, and C. Okay, Now, from there, okay, buy bonds to decrease the interest rate. So both parts of that question, the first part of D and E, are correct. Okay, so I'm gonna have to read on. Okay, so buy bonds to decrease the interest rate and to decrease aggregate demand. Well, buy bonds decreases the interest rate, but that means aggregate demand actually increases. So D is wrong in itself. Okay, so I can mark D out, and all that leaves me with is E. Okay, buy bonds to decrease the interest rate and to increase aggregate demand. And then if I want to take that a step further and double check myself, I know if I'm increasing aggregate demand, I'm increasing output, meaning that people are going to go to work. Okay, we need people to produce more stuff, so we would have to increase aggregate demand. Okay, so E is going to be the correct answer on that one. Okay. Okay, so if you want to change your answer, now would be the time to do it before I change the slide. Okay. All right. One last multiple choice, and then we're going to move on to ample reserves, the new graph. All right, the purchase of bonds by a central bank will have the greatest effect on real gross domestic product if which of the following situations exist in the economy? This one's tough. Okay, looks like we have settled. All right, so let's run through these answer options. Okay, if I'm purchasing bonds, my mind should go to limited reserve system. Okay, because remember, buying bonds in an ample reserve system is going to change the supply of reserves, but it's not really going to change the interest rate. Okay, so that actually enables me to mark out A, B, and E. Okay, we don't have to worry about any of those because it's talking about ample reserves. Okay, so we are left with C and D. So let's walk through C and D both. Okay, the banking system has limited reserves. The required reserve ratio is low. Okay, both of those are checks. Bonds are going to affect a lot whenever that is in place. Okay, and the interest rate has a large effect on investment spending. That sounds like the right answer to me. Okay, we have limited reserves, meaning whenever we buy bonds, it increases the money supply. Okay, and it lowers the interest rate. So that's going to increase our spending. Whenever the required reserve ratio is low, banks are lending out a lot. Okay, so they're happy to lend money. So C is going to be the correct answer on this one. Okay, now let's look at D because we were stuck between C and D as well. Right, the banking system has limited reserves, the required reserve ratio is low, and the marginal propensity to consume is low. Okay, red flag for me on that one would be talking about the MPC. Okay, and then second red flag is marginal propensity to consume is low. Well, that means I'm not spending any money. Okay, so buying bonds isn't going to matter if I'm not going to go spend the money. So D would not be correct on this one. Okay. All right, so C as in cat is the correct answer if you want to change. All right, so let's roll on into ample reserves. And my students say I'm crazy because I actually like drawing this graph. Um, they think I'm crazy because I love graphing. I'll explain why here in a little bit. All right, so ample reserves, there's one tool that they will probably talk about, and that is changing administered interest rates. Okay, and I am requiring that my students write administered interest rates whenever it asks about monetary policy and ample reserves. Okay, because we don't know what they really want just yet. All right, so those two administered interest rates are going to be interest on reserve balances and the discount rate. Okay, so remember that rate the Fed charges to borrow, or well, central bank charges to borrow money. Okay, that's the discount rate in the United States. So you can refer to it as well. Okay, so remember our reserve requirement is 0. So changing the reserve requirement is not going to help. Buying and selling bonds is just going to move us along that already vertical line, not changing any rates. Okay, so we've got to do something else. And this actually changed back in 2008, whenever the housing bubble burst. So if you want more reading on that, we don't have time to go in depth in class, but that is when it changed, if that's something that you're just super interested in. Okay, all right. So let's talk about some vocabulary. Reserves, total cash that banks have in their vaults and in their deposits at their central bank. Okay, so I don't think we are the only system that uses ample reserves, but more than likely we will focus on the US in the exam would be my guess. Okay, so discount rate that banks pay to borrow from the Fed. Okay, so I think that is a pretty US specific term. And then of course, College Board uses it for any interest rate that we pay to a central bank. Okay, if there is a change in the discount rate, it moves the upper bound. Now, you don't label this. Okay, there's not a label on the upper bound as of right now. This is exactly like the graph from the course exam description. So this is what we expect to see drawn. Okay, so the upper bound as of right now does not have a label, but you've got to have these little dashed lines. Okay, and this is the discount rate. Now, whenever the Fed changes the discount rate, the interest on reserve balances follows. Okay, and that is the rate that commercial banks earn on reserves. Not that they pay, they earn on reserves. So whenever they have their money deposited at the central bank, okay, so this is like Wells Fargo having their money in their vault at the Fed, they earn interest on that deposit. Okay, and this is our primary tool right now. And that is the lower bound. So this bound down here where we see DR. Okay, and that's what we use to change the federal funds rate. Okay, and that's going to move that lower bound. Now, as of right now, okay, anytime that they say a change in interest rates, you move both bounds. We don't move them individually. Okay, they move together. They essentially act as a price ceiling and a price floor. If you can think all the way back to Unit 1, I know that was a very long time ago. Okay, so we will not move them independently. If one moves, the other follows. Okay, are there any questions on that? No? Okay, I do want to point out the labels on this, the policy rate and PRE. Okay, so to kind of condense that, I think they settled on policy rate. So we don't put administered interest rates, we don't put federal funds, we don't put discount rate, it's just the policy rate. Okay, and that's the rate that the central bank can directly say, this is our interest rate. Okay, we just shorten it to policy rate. And down here on the horizontal axis, it's quantity of reserves. As of right now, there is no label at the bottom of supply of reserves, according to the CED. And everything I've seen, there has not been a label. If you want to put a Q, I don't think it would hurt you, but I don't think it's required either. Okay. All right, so let's look at manipulating this curve. Okay, because that's the fun part. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to add this part. All right, market interest rates would fall. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. Okay. So the economy is currently operating below full employment. The central bank decides to take action and operates under ample reserves. What action should the central bank take, and what would the effect be on the graphs below? All right, so on your Pear Deck, there should be a text option. If you can't find it, that's okay. But if you can, go ahead and type in what they would do. Are they going to raise or lower the policy rate? I'll give you a few more seconds. I don't want to run out of time. Okay, so let's look at this one. And the wording on this is tricky. Okay, and we did that simply because this is one of the things that you could see. All right, so the economy is currently operating below full employment. Okay, and what that means is we are not at full employment, not unemployment, not natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so we have people that want jobs. Okay, so that's going to tell me I'm in a negative output gap. Okay, and if I'm in a negative output gap, then if I'm the central bank, I know I want to lower the policy rate. Okay, so for example, whenever COVID started, okay, our policy rate was like 0 to 0.25%. Okay, that was to encourage that spending. All right, so if we're looking at this on the graph, we're getting closer to 0. And remember, 0 is always right here. Okay, now one thing I want to emphasize, this is not a shift. Okay, I saw a couple where like you tried to shift the curve. It is not a shift. Okay, it is simply, and you can laugh because my lines are going to be terrible. Okay, the rate is simply moving Let me see if I can draw the other one without it looking terrible. Okay, the rate is simply moving closer to zero. And then you have to have the little dash lines. Okay, and if I try to do all them, they're going to be so bad. Okay, so but dash lines there and dash lines here. Okay, all the way back. And you might want to make that change a little bit more drastic. Drawing it on Zoom is not easy. Okay, so we have PR1, and we can see, and you can actually draw the arrow if you want to show a little more. Okay, we can see the policy rate lowers. Now, notice I didn't draw a new demand of reserves. Okay, because it's not a new curve. The bounds just simply moved. Okay, and then over here, for the sake of time, I'm not going to try to draw it. Okay, AD would shift to the right because administered interest rates have lowered, making it cheaper to borrow money, increasing C or I, and shifting AD to the right. Okay. All right, so let's look at the pretty answers is what I call them. Okay, you have my new policy rate labeled, AD shifting to the right, back to full employment. Okay. All right, so let's try again. This time we're the opposite. We are operating above full employment, indicating an inflationary gap. Okay, so the central bank decides to take action and operates under ample reserves. What action should they take, and what would the effect be on the graphs? Hey. Hey guys, I'm gonna have to mute for just a minute.
I'll pop on here, just giving a little bit more feedback. And I think we're getting close to wanting to move on so that you can get a look at some multiple choice questions. So wrap up any ideas, take about 15 more seconds. Does that work, Ms. Howard? Perfect.
Okay. All right, so I did star one answer. This is by far the prettiest graph I've ever seen drawn on Pear Deck. Okay, I should be back for just a minute. I may have to mute again in just a second. All right, so we're going to raise administered interest rates. The only thing I would add interest rates just to be triple sure. And then we have our increase in the policy rate, which is very obviously not a new shift, and there was no new label, so that is perfect. All right, and then we had a decrease in AD showing back to full employment and the price level decreasing. Okay, so this looks good to me. I think I'd give it full credit for both shift and show point. Okay. All right, and then of course, my pretty graph will be on the Pear Deck whenever you receive it. All right, and for time's sake, we're gonna just pick a few of these and go through them. Okay, so pick your answer on this one. To reduce inflation, the central bank would be most likely to, okay, and tell me which one of those would work. All right, looks like we have kind of settled. All right, so let's run through these really quick. If we decrease the reserve requirement, then that means we're lowering that amount that banks are required to hold in reserves. So they're going to loan out more money. Okay, so that's going to do the opposite. That's going to increase inflation. Okay, decreasing the income tax rate. Well, that's going to make people spend more money, shifting AD to the right, raising price level. So that's the opposite of reducing inflation again. All right, same thing with C. We're buying bonds. We're putting money into the money supply. D is the same as C. Okay, we're increasing supply of money, and all that leaves us with is E. Okay, if we increase our administered interest rates, that's going to raise the price of loans, okay, the cost of borrowing money, which is going to decrease inflation. Okay. All right, so correct answer on that is E. Okay, and I am going to skip 2 multiple choice questions. Okay, just for sake of time, because I don't want to keep you after 5. Okay, and y'all are guinea pigs. We've never used this session before, so we can shorten it after this. Okay, so we're going to skip. We're just going to skip that one. All right, so if a country's economy is operating below the full employment level of output at a very low inflation rate, the central bank of the country is most likely to. All right, so let's look at the answer on this one. The correct answer is C, and it seems like we're kind of stuck between A and C. Okay. The major difference between A and C is the pursue an expansionary monetary policy because it is required by law. Okay, it is not required by law. Central banks are not under the control of the government. Okay, they kind of can do their own thing, which can be good for us because people at the central bank should be pretty well qualified. Okay, so they are not required by law to pursue any type of monetary policy. Okay, they choose as economists. All right, and then of course, B, it would not be B because that's not fiscal policy. C would be correct. Lower interest rates generates an increase in output. D, selling bonds would do the opposite of increase output, so D would not be correct. Okay, and E is not a monetary policy. The central bank cannot control interest or income taxes. Okay. All right, and then we're going to skip this next question and go on to the survey. We appreciate y'all hanging in there with us. I know we're about a minute over. Okay, so if you have any questions, go ahead and write them in. You will put feedback in the Google form. You should be able to click on it on the Pear Deck. Okay, it'll look like this. Make sure and tell us, name of your school, student, teacher, so on. Okay, and that's just to help us improve. And I will definitely remove some multiple choice questions. So thank you for being our guinea pigs. Okay, so we did have a question about navigating the wording of questions. Are you meaning like your answers or how to figure out what the question's asking? And you can unmute if you want to, it's completely up to you. Okay, so this one's tough, and we always struggle with it for a couple of weeks whenever I start teaching, especially ADAS. Okay, so you have to read really carefully, and I think we get in this mindset fast is better. And some of these, you're going to have to slow down. Okay, so like below full employment. Okay, if I know full employment, let's say is 80%. Okay, and you can pick whatever numbers to throw in this. If full employment's 80%, I'm below that, meaning like 70% of people that want a job have a job. Okay, then that's going to tell me recessionary gap because that means my unemployment level is rising. And those types of questions are kind of hard. The other question, I actually printed a couple of examples today. Let me pull those. Okay, one of mine, like assume that the current unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate. Okay, I've got to stop and I've got to think about that. Okay, the natural rate, say 5%, and current unemployment is 2%. Well, that tells me inflationary gap. Okay, does that kind of help? And yes, practice makes everything so much easier. And you can always talk to your teacher and say, hey, can we have some prompt practice? I know I've made a couple of different versions. If they want to reach out to me, I'm happy to send it to them. I have a lot of resources on that because that's something that I think everybody struggles with for a while.
I know that's something that we practice daily in my class is decoding these questions, trying to get to the root of what the heck are they actually saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and I went through, I guess it was last year or the year before last, and I tried to pull like every single ADAS FRQ, and I pulled all of the beginning prompts, and I put them in a document. I'm like, okay, what kind of gap is it? And we went through every single one. It takes a while, but it's worth it. So yeah, practice on those.
Miss Howard, if you would love to share any of those practice resources with me, I would love to take them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I actually looked at one today because I was looking for something else. And yeah, I was like, I need to do this again.
Yeah. When you were talking about like explaining practice,
Yeah.
yeah, we have to do that a lot because they'll leave it about one step short a lot of
Mhm.
times. And it's like, I can't draw this conclusion.
Yeah. And now there are, I know there are a couple of teachers still on, but Megan has a really good monetary policy sort in the Canvas page. I've been working on a fiscal policy sort for I don't know how long. But if I ever get that done, I'll share it with y'all. But it is so worth it because it's something that they do struggle with. And like today we did graph wars, and I don't know if my student is still on. I think she is. I don't know if she's actually here. But I give them a scenario and you got to graph it. If it's right, you get a point. And then I'll add another graph or change the scenario, or the government changes something, or the central bank changes something. And then whoever has the most points gets 100 for a daily grade. And then second gets 90 and third gets 80 and so on. And it's always fun and it's good on the fly practice. And I give them big whiteboards or they draw on the desk, and they always think that's fun too.
Yeah, we just got the desks that you can draw on this
Yeah.
year. And it's a game changer.
Yeah.
A few kids are still shocked, like when I come by and write on, they're like,
Yep.
we're rebellious here.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, guys, you have permission.
I'm filling out the last little thing. Do you want to go? Is it cool if I stop the recording?
Yeah. All right. So those of you that are still on, we have any questions, comments? You will get the takeaways, hopefully shortly. It depends on